Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. This week, we're going to start really driving forward into, again, this question of the journey from lifelessness to life. And we've bridged the gap. A couple weeks ago, we talked about how improbable and basically impossible that is to bridge that gap between lifelessness and life. And then we've talked about the lack of truth in the examples that are given to us to support Darwinian theory for a few weeks. We're going to tear back into this week the question of the cell. And I want to illustrate the problem that we're going to face by talking about one of our favorite things that we like to watch on television. My wife and I love to watch those shows on television that show how something is made. So how potato chips are made, or how Cheetos are made, or Hershey's Kisses, or Reese's peanut butter cups, something like that. All healthy things, as you can tell by, my description. But it's fascinating to watch the machines that come together to produce some of our favorite snacks and foods that we like and things like that. The problem that you run into when you look at this from our perspective in this journey that we're in is that every time you find a machine or an assembly line of machines, a system you might say, that when you find something like this, it has purpose. Those machines are all lined up together, and at the end of the process, they produce a Twinkie or a Reese's peanut butter cup or whatever it might be. But you have this enormously complex group of machines that one step along the way, they all know their job, they all function for a very specific reason, and at the end of the process, they produce, again, some of our favorite snacks. So as you look at that, and you look at the complexity of what they bring together, it begs the question of what we see in life all around us. And this week, I want to talk about the cell again. We talked about the cell a few weeks ago when we talked about how impossible it would be to make this jump from lifelessness to life. And I want to expand on one of the points that we started into a few weeks ago when we discussed that. When we look at the cell, that foundational piece that makes up us, there are going to be a couple of problems that we run into. And largely, evolution just gets a pass on this. It's one of those things that we just kind of skip over and we go, well, sure, it's complex, and we just move on. Nothing to see here. You just don't worry about it. But I want you to think for a minute as we begin to unpack this. The interesting thing about the cells that make up you or me or our dogs or animals or fish or you name it, each one of these cells is a little teeny tiny machine that is designed, and I'm using that on purpose, we'll get there in a second, to build us. It's not that I think sometimes when we talk about evolution, we just kind of step back and we go, well, look at the cell. The cell is amazing. And we're kind of impressed by how it works and all of these things, but we don't oftentimes talk enough about what it does. I want to go back to our old friend, Richard Dawkins. We love Richard Dawkins, and looking at his quotes. And again, this is a quote that we've talked about from him previously. But it's talking about the likelihood of bringing all this together. Now, I want to just quote from this here as we look at this. Nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck. Anthropically justified, of course. For example, my colleague Mark Ridley in Mendel's Demon has suggested that the origin of the eukaryotic cell, our kind of cell, with a nucleus and various other complicated features such as mitochondria, which are not present in bacteria, was an even more momentous, difficult, and statistically improbable step than the origin of life. I think he's onto something there. Natural selection, I'm going to skip a little further into Dawkins' quote, natural selection works because it is a cumulative, one-way street to improvement. It needs some luck to get it started. That's maybe the understatement of the century. And the billions of planets anthropic principle grants it that luck. Maybe a few later gaps in the evolutionary story also need major infusions of luck with anthropic justification. So Dawkins basically jumps the shark here and says, well, don't worry about it. All you need is time and luck, and you can get it there. And his friend, I don't think he listens quite nearly well enough to his friend in all of this. His colleagues' point to him is that if you think it's unlikely to go from the chemical world to the biological world, you're talking about going to something that is so immensely complex in the cells that make up us that it's even way more unlikely than that. And his friend's onto something there. There's no question. So when we look at this, the problem that we've got, again, each one of those little cells has a purpose to it. It is designed to build us. It's not that it just happens to build us. Not that, when you think about of machinery and things like that, I want to talk about this and bring it together with a few quotes, but when you think about machinery exists for a purpose. And this is going to cause a couple of problems as we look at this and as we talk about the cell. So first and foremost, any machine at all, good, bad, or indifferent, even simple machines, require that all of the various working parts all come together. Why? Because there's purpose. They all have to come together to accomplish a task. And cells don't just freely exist on their own for our purposes of what we're looking at here. The cell that we're trying to analyze, the cell that's behind us, is an enormously complex piece of machinery that ultimately builds us. So again, when you look at this, I want to go back to a couple of quotes from Drs. Lewis and Barnes in their book, A Fortunate Universe. Another great resource, by the way, that I forgot to include in my mention of good resources for looking at these kinds of things. But I love their quote and how they address this. Firstly, life, even a single simple cell, is a miracle of complexity. Every cell in your body, for example, has molecular machines for moving itself, tagging and transporting molecules, processing food, defending against invaders, DNA duplication, and repair, which is amazing. You think about what that takes in our computers to be able to manage information and repair it when it breaks. How many of our computers do a good job of repairing the operating system when they break? Otherwise, you get the blue screen of death and you have to reboot. Continuing on. Producing proteins and receiving and processing outside signals. When you think about that in this age of computers, we understand what it would take to design a computer that would do all of that. This is done at a microscopic level inside of us. And we just kind of blow it off like it's no big deal. But I'm fascinated watching a television show how potato chips are made because I recognize the engineering that went into making a potato chip. The disconnect here and how we just don't connect these dots with evolution is amazing. Anyway, sorry, back to the quote. On top of all of that, this entire machine can tear itself in half and produce a complete working copy of itself in about 20 minutes. That, obviously, to say that blows away potato chip making machines, just to say the least. But we just kind of gloss over that. And we don't think about the fact that to build us at a microscopic level, we have machines working inside of us that do all of this incredible work. Later in the book, they say the cell can be thought of as a colossal factory, a city even, a Rube Goldberg contraption of interconnected assembly lines, machines, highways, transporters, blueprints, and more. It would be extremely surprising if life on Earth went to all of that bother if it's easy to make. In other words, if life is so easy, why in the world is the cell so complex? You remember Stephen Hawking's quote from a few weeks ago, life just simply seems to be what happens. But if you look at how complex the cell is, it does beg the question, well, it doesn't seem to be simple at all, because to build us, the little cells inside of us are immensely complex. I had mentioned Fred Hoyle, and I thought we were done with quotes from Fred Hoyle, but I love this one, so I had to throw it in. The chance that higher life forms might have emerged this way, evolution, is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. He's exactly right. We just naturally assume that the cell all came together on its own. And if it had come all together on its own, that would be one thing, and it would be miraculous. And when we look back on it and say, oh my goodness, it's incredible, how could this have happened? But when you think about it all came together on its own, and buried inside of it, and this is going to be our second problem, our second point in all of this, is the information necessary to use this complex machinery inside the cell for the purpose of building us. The most amazing and complex thing that we see on the planet And that is going to be what we talk about for the next probably couple months as we break this down. We forget sometimes how incredibly complex we are. We are not impressed enough when we look in the mirror. We should be blown away by how well designed and put together we are. And we're going to talk about that and drive that point home over the weeks upcoming. But again, let's keep walking through this. So when we see the information contained in us, again, information is always working towards something. So when we look at the cell, we should be looking at a couple of different things. Number one is going to be, what is that finished product that it's working to? In other words, what is that purpose? And an engineer, when we think about this, any machine that's built to produce something, which is exactly what happens with us, the cells inside of us are designed to produce us. That only comes from an engineer. An engineer puts a machine together for a specific purpose. We've talked about potato chips and candy and all sorts of interesting things. But that is designed by engineers who are incredibly smart, who put all of those things together so that the outcome, the purpose, is produced in each one. The other question you've got to look at in all of this is, okay, well, ultimately speaking, I need to build this. I need to build a potato chip. How am I going to do that? Then you've got to put together the machine capable of doing it. And this was put together at a microscopic level. We should just be blown away. And Darwin's theory, purports to claim that, well, natural selection and random mutation can explain all of these things. I've mentioned it before, and I'll say it again. Natural selection and random mutation cannot explain the beginnings of anything. They may be able to explain how existing things improve and get better. We all understand that. That, again, is microevolution. But macroevolution, explaining how we got some of these things, and that's going to be what we see in the episodes to come in the next few weeks. Macroevolution, Darwin's theory just can't touch it. It can't go anywhere near that. And again, we've talked about some of these quotes here from a few weeks ago. This is from Stephen Meyer's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. This was a quote that we talked about a few weeks ago when we talked about the jump from lifelessness to life. But again, I want to bring this up to point to this question of, well, what would it be like? And we talked about it last time, a few weeks ago, when we were looking at what are the odds of bringing all of this together. And we talked about a number, I think it was 10 to the 79th billionth power when we talk about all this. So again, walking through this is referring to a couple of different scientists. Tompa and Rose have demonstrated mathematically that even having all of the requisite parts for a cell will not ensure that those ingredients will self-organize into a living system. Again, you need to put them together into a machine that works to produce a specific product, which is us. That's what he's saying there. Instead, the cell, like the individual genes or proteins, faces an extreme combinational problem. Tompa and Rose calculate, building on the work of protein scientist Cyrus Leventhal, that there are a whopping 10 to the 79th billion different ways of combining just the proteins into a relatively simple unicellular yeast. That number only grows exponentially larger when biologists attempt to calculate the number of possible ways of combining all of the proteins and all of the other large molecular components necessary for that one-celled organism, including DNA and RNA, DNA and RNA molecules, ribosomes, lipids, and glycopid molecules, and others. Get this in comparison. The number of possible combinations of these cellular components vastly exceeds the number of elementary particles in the universe, 10 to the 80th power. That's the 80th power. That's the number of particles in the universe. And we're talking about something of 10 to the 79th billionth power. And even the number of events since the Big Bang, 10 to the 139th power. That tells you how impossible these numbers are once again. And I know I throw numbers at you sometimes because I'm an accountant and it's what I enjoy doing, is numbers. Math never lies. You can never prove math wrong, and math never lies. People lie, and they use math to lie, but math never lies. And in this case, when you're looking at something, again, the number of particles in the universe, number of elementary particles in the universe, 10 to the 80th power. That's 80. We're talking about something of getting that living cell together, 10 to the 79th billionth power. That's a 79 with, I don't know, 9 zeros after it. 9 zeros. It's just literally impossible. So this is the problem that we're going to face. And the reason I wanted to go back to this, because we talked about this a few weeks ago, we just kind of pass over it. We talk about how unlikely it would be to make the jump, and we just put the word, we say, well, that's a cell. But we don't say what cells actually do. Cells build us. It is a microscopic factory inside of us that builds us. And like I said, we should be way more impressed with it than we are. And the idea that it all just happened by random chance. Again, even if you put together the world's first perfect working cell, when did it change to start producing people? And why would it do that? Where does the information come in? Where does the information come from to be able to build something as ambitious as us? It is literally remarkable that evolution just simply gets a pass on this question. We have bridged the gap of irreducible complexity. And over the weeks to come, what we're going to be talking about is things like this, how you could have something that is so incredibly complex that at some point it cannot be broken down into any more simple components than what it already is. And we're going to talk about that more in the weeks to come. At some point you have something, a machine, that is so incredibly complex that at some point it couldn't possibly have self-assembled. It required intelligence to do it. And that's what we've kind of breached the surface of here. So I think this is a good point to stop. We're going to talk more about this in the weeks to come as we get ready to move into summertime this year. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. And like I said, in the weeks to come, we're really going to break this down so that we can all get to that place of understanding, well, where did I come from? How likely is it that Darwin's theory could actually explain what we see around us? And what you're going to find is the answer is it can't. But again, I'll back that up in the weeks to come and we'll take a look at this. Once again, thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the podcast and the subscribe button for the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. I always get that one mixed up. You can find our podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, and of course on YouTube. You can also reach us at our website at prooftograce.com, and you can reach out to us via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. I want to thank you again for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and if you did, I hope to see you next week. Thank you so much for coming. Bye-bye.